They called me wife, mother, heir, but none of those titles prepared me for the day I became the enemy of the very family I had sworn to belong to. This is the story of how one man's love lifted me to the top of the world, and how his family's hatred hurled me into the void. My life in Greenwich, Connecticut, was a perfect portrait in shades of gold and green. I woke every morning to the smell of jasmine drifting through the open bedroom window, the sun filtering through silk curtains and dancing over mahogany furniture. The house was a sanctuary of order and beauty, polished marble floors, staircases that seemed made for silent parades, paintings that told stories of prosperity. I, Elena Vance, was the curator of that dream. I organized dinners with inherited silver, chose flowers for porcelain vases, and dressed Sophie, my 5-year-old daughter, in organic cotton dresses that smelled of lavender. David, my husband, was the invisible foundation of that existence. His love had been my passport into a world where laughter was soft, problems were abstract, and the future seemed like a straight, rising line. The Covington family, my in-laws, brothers and sisters-in-law, uncles and aunts, smiled at gala parties and offered hugs at holidays, and I, naive, believed those smiles were real. I believed that by marrying David I had not only entered a new family, but stepped into a safe harbor that would last forever. But fate does not knock. It breaks the door down. The news of David's death arrived on an autumn afternoon, wrapped in the frozen silence of a call from the hospital. Car accident, they said. Empty words that could not contain the violence of his absence. The world collapsed in slow motion. I remember looking at my hands on the steering wheel on the way to the hospital and not recognizing them, trembling, pale. They belonged to a stranger. The funeral was a spectacle of pain and hypocrisy. Under a fine rain that fell like tears from the sky, the Covingtons gathered in impeccable black, their faces masks of grief carefully choreographed. No eyes met mine. No hand reached out to comfort me. I felt invisible in the middle of that mourning crowd, a widow who had suddenly become a ghost in her own life. That was when the family lawyer handed me the will. The words swam on the page, but one clause stood out like a knife. All of David's assets were bound to a family trust controlled by the Covingtons. I was not the heir. I was a conditional beneficiary, and the condition was their approval. The ground beneath my feet was no longer marble. It was quicksand. The first choice came days later, in a meeting room with oak walls and portraits of stern ancestors. The patriarch, Robert Covington, sat across from me, his hands clasped on the table like a judge ready to deliver a verdict. He did not offer condolences. He offered a deal. I was to renounce any claim to the inheritance, the house, even David's keepsakes, in exchange for a monthly allowance that would barely cover Sophie's expenses. It was a surrender contract, an admission that I had never truly belonged to that world. I looked out the window to the perfect gardens where Sophie played innocently, and a chill ran down my spine. I refused. The word came out as a hoarse whisper, but it carried a strength I did not know I had. Robert neither smiled nor frowned. He simply nodded, as if I had finally followed the script he had written. That night, looking at Sophie asleep, her serene face lit by the moon, I had no idea my refusal would ignite a revenge that would turn our world to ashes. The contract of silence was broken, and the war had begun. What began as a war over inheritance turned into a fight for my daughter's very soul. In the first days after my refusal, the house in Greenwich no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a fortress under siege. Every sound echoed like a warning, the clinking of glasses in the cabinet, the wind whispering at the windows, the silence that settled between me and Sophie like a third ghostly presence. My 5-year-old girl, all purity, still did not understand the darkness gathering around us. She asked for David with a heartbreaking innocence, "Will Daddy come read me a story tonight?" Her words were shards of reality dressed in sweetness, and I, with trembling hands, tried to piece together fragile puzzles of lies to protect her small, delicate world. Our days became a ritual of silent resistance. In the morning, I took her out to the garden, where she ran between the rose bushes as if nothing had changed. Her blonde hair flew in the wind, and her laughter was the only sound that still pierced the fog of grief wrapped around me. At night, I lulled her to sleep in the same mahogany bed that David had chosen with such care. Her heavy eyes would close, and I stayed, watching her soft breathing, feeling the crushing weight of being her only anchor in a stormy sea. In those hours, our vulnerability bound us together, me, a woman learning to be strong out of necessity, she, a child unknowingly being trained for a war that was not hers. We shared the same unspoken fear, the same emptiness left by David, and the same love for him, now our invisible shield. The values David had given us, honesty, courage, loyalty, were being tested as never before. I remembered his words, spoken at one of our last family dinners, "What matters is not what we have, Elena, but who we are." At the time, it sounded like a line from a self-help book. Now, it was a mantra echoing in my mind every time Sophie looked at me with absolute trust. She did not need mansions or inheritances. She needed a mother who would show her that dignity is worth more than comfort. By refusing the Covington's agreement, I had turned that belief into our flag. Our shared values were not in bank accounts or jewelry, but in the way I held her when she woke, in the stories I invented to explain David's absence, in the silent promise that nothing, not wealth, not revenge, would steal her childhood. The moment of truth came on a rainy afternoon when Sophie found a photo of David and me in the park. She pointed at the image and asked, with a serenity that did not belong to a child, "Mom, Grandpa Robert said Daddy did not love us anymore. Is that true?" Ice spread through my veins. They were already planting seeds of doubt in her, using her innocence as a weapon. In that instant, I understood that the battle was no longer about property or money. It was about the story of our family, about Sophie's right to know she had been loved, about the truth the Covingtons wanted to erase. They threatened not only our present, but our past and our future. I could not allow them to poison David's memory in her heart. That was the moment our connection grew stronger, not because of what we had, but because of what we were willing to lose together. And then the letter arrived, a legal document announcing that they were contesting Sophie's custody. The Covingtons did not only want our fortune, they wanted my child. They claimed I was an unstable mother, incapable of providing an adequate environment. The bond one had believed unbreakable was under attack, and the tie that held us up would be tested in ways I could not yet imagine. Our resistance awakened a predator that does not accept being challenged. The Covingtons were no longer elegant shadows at funerals or soft voices in meeting rooms. They were now a force of nature, relentless and calculating, advancing on Sophie and me with the coldness of an endless winter. The first strike came through a legal complaint that arrived in a brown envelope, addressed in impersonal handwriting. It was a lawsuit for undue influence over David, claiming I had emotionally manipulated him for my benefit when drafting his will. The words were sharp weapons, twisting every gesture of love into a ruthless strategy. My heart raced as I read the accusations. It was as if they were scribbling over our story with poisonous ink, turning sacred memories into evidence of a crime I had never committed. In that moment, I felt the ground shake beneath my feet, not out of fear of what I might lose, but because of the brutality of the lie they were trying to impose on the world. Within days, the freezing of assets was ordered. Bank accounts were sealed, credit cards blocked, and even the necklace David gave me on our anniversary, a simple pearl pendant, was listed as disputed property. The house in Greenwich, once a symbol of safety, became a golden prison. Every object, the grand piano on which David played, the books he read to Sophie, seemed to accuse me of not protecting him from his family's greed. I began to avoid the neighbors' eyes, because the whispers followed me like shadows. Friends who once filled our dining room now looked away at the supermarket, afraid to be associated with a social outcast. The humiliation was a constant weight, a bitter taste in my mouth with every forced smile I gave to shield Sophie from the outside world. She, with her child's perception, started to sense the change. She asked why we no longer went to the club, why visits had stopped, and I answered with tight hugs and fragile lies that hurt more than the truth. The peak of the threat arrived on a rainy morning, when a court officer appeared at the door with an eviction order. His expression was neutral, professional, but his eyes avoided mine, as if I carried a contagious disease. Sophie stood by my leg, holding onto it, her eyes wide with confusion. Explaining that we had to leave that house, the only home she had ever known, was one of the most painful tasks of my life. Her silent tears slid down her cheeks like proof that I had failed to protect her. As we packed the essentials into improvised bags, every object left behind was a piece of our identity being torn away. The Covingtons did not want only our wealth. They wanted our story, our dignity, our right to belong anywhere. That night, we drove to a cheap motel on the outskirts of Bridgeport, far from the perfumed gardens of Greenwich. A thin drizzle coated the car in a dirty mist, and the flickering motel sign. Vacancies felt like a cruel joke. The room smelled of mold and disinfectant, with peeling walls and a hard bed that creaked at every movement. Sophie fell asleep quickly, exhausted, her face still marked by crying. I sat at the edge of the bed, watching the headlights of passing cars cut through the dark, and for the first time I allowed the wave of despair to crash over me. Everything I had believed in, loyalty, family, justice, had collapsed like a house of cards. The Covingtons were not just adversaries. They were the architects of a meticulous fall, and I was plummeting with no safety net. The door of the motel trembled with the wind, and the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the sound of the abyss swallowing us. Outside, the world went on, indifferent, while I sat in the dark, wondering how much more we would have to lose before we reached a bottom that did not seem to exist. Facing the abyss opening under our feet, I had to choose between surrender, which promised immediate relief, and resistance, which guaranteed a war without end. The next morning at the motel brought a heavy silence, broken only by distant traffic and Sophie's calm breathing as she slept. As the pale light of dawn slipped through the dirty curtain and painted the room with tones of discouragement, my fingers traced the edges of a new envelope that had been slid under the door during the night. This time, it was not a legal document, but a personal letter from Robert Covington, written on paper so thin and elegant it seemed to cut the skin when touched. The words were a seductive trap. He offered to withdraw the custody suit, restore access to a modest account, and even ensure that Sophie had proper education and health care, all in exchange for my signature on a confidentiality and non-dispute agreement. It was surrender dressed up as salvation, a pact that would force me to bury forever the truth about David and his family, to seal our story in silence in exchange for crumbs of security. And the highest price of all? Sophie would grow up believing her mother chose cowardly silence over courageous honesty. Every syllable of that letter was a test of my character. Sitting on the edge of the bed, the paper trembling in my hands, I felt the crushing weight of the dilemma. On one side, I saw Sophie in a safe school, in clean clothes, with a predictable future, everything any mother would want. On the other, I saw her soul shaped by a false narrative, where her father's love was erased and my integrity sold for comfort. I remembered David, how he always said the greatest inheritance we could leave Sophie was not material, but moral, the example that some battles are worth fighting, even if you lose them. Now those words echoed in me like a verdict. The emotional cost was palpable, the loneliness of resistance, the constant fear of failing to protect her, the cruel doubt that my stubbornness might be nothing more than ego dressed as principle. Sophie woke and came to curl up in my lap, her child's warmth a painful contrast to the cold decision I had to make. She said nothing, just rested her head on my shoulder, and in that silent embrace I felt all the innocence at stake. The following days were a whirlwind of anguish. We walked through the city, Sophie watching the world with eyes that were beginning to lose their innocence. She saw other children in well-kept parks, families entering elegant stores, and her questions grew sharper. "Mom, why can we not go back home?" My answers were evasive, but inside my heart screamed the truth. At night, in the dark motel room, I replayed every moment with David, our dinners where he defended honesty above everything, the stories he told about overcoming adversity, the pride in his eyes when I took a firm stand. These memories were not just nostalgia, they were a mirror reflecting the person I needed to be. Surrendering to the Covingtons would mean betraying not only myself, but the core of what David had taught us. It would mean admitting that love can be bought and that dignity has a price. Deep in my soul, I knew no amount of money could fill the emptiness that choice would leave in Sophie when she grew up and understood what I had done. The decisive moment came on a rainy afternoon, as I watched Sophie drawing with a pencil we had found on the floor. She drew our family, 3 figures holding hands under a smiling sun. Beside it, she scribbled the word forever. That simple image was my bolt of clarity. I understood that fighting was not about winning or losing. It was about honoring the forever that David had promised us. I wrote a reply to Robert Covington, refusing his offer with a firmness that surprised even me. I explained that I preferred the uncertainty of truth to the comfort of lies, and that Sophie deserved to grow up knowing her mother had chosen integrity, not submission. When I mailed that letter, a wave of serotonin seemed to wash through my anxiety. It was not happiness, but the deep satisfaction of having done the right thing, regardless of the consequences. I knew the battle would grow harsher, that the Covingtons would strike back with doubled ferocity. But for the first time since David's death, I felt whole, aligned with the values that defined who I was. The choice was made. I was no longer fighting only for justice. I was defending my daughter's soul and the legacy of the man we loved. And as I sealed the envelope, I whispered to the wind, "May the sacrifice be worth it." My choice for dignity cost us every last trace of who we had been. The Covingtons' answer to my refusal was not only swift, it was an avalanche calculated to bury any remaining sliver of hope I still carried. 2 weeks after I sent back the unsigned agreement, a new lawsuit arrived, this time challenging my mental and emotional fitness as a mother, with paid witnesses, former employees, pressured neighbors, describing me as unstable, paranoid, and unable to provide even the basics for Sophie. The court, swayed by the weight of the Covington name, issued a temporary order suspending my full custody until the case could be examined. Sophie was not taken from me completely, but I was now supervised, a mother under watch, treated as a potential risk to her own child. The humiliation was like poison in my veins every time the social worker visited, her critical gaze inspecting our motel room as if it were a cell. Isolation became our new reality. The few people who still dared to speak to me, an old coworker, an elderly neighbor, disappeared after receiving intimidating letters from the family's lawyers. Even the motel owner, pressured by sudden health inspections and subtle threats, asked us to leave. We ended up in a municipal shelter in Bridgeport, a place of peeling walls and metal beds lined up like tombs. The smell of cheap disinfectant and human sweat thickened the air, and the sounds, babies crying, arguments at night, doors creaking, were a constant echo of our despair. Sophie, who once laughed in perfumed gardens, now curled beside me on a thin mattress, her eyes losing their sparkle a little more each day. She stopped talking about David, stopped drawing, stopped asking about the future. Her silence was a scream of pain I could not quiet. Our lowest point came on a freezing December night. Sophie woke up feverish, with a dry cough that shook her entire body. Her temperature shot up quickly, and I, with no health insurance, canceled after the assets were frozen, could not take her to a private hospital. At the public clinic, the wait lasted hours, dozens of people crammed into plastic chairs. I held Sophie in my arms, her hot body pressed against mine, as the line moved in agonizing slow motion. When we were finally seen, the doctor, overwhelmed and exhausted, prescribed a generic syrup and sent us away with a tired sigh. On the way back to the shelter, under a thin rain that seemed to wash away the last remnants of my dignity, Sophie whispered, "Mom, I want to go home." This time, I did not have the strength to lie. I simply held her tightly, my tears mixing with the rain. In that moment, I was no longer Elena Vance, the confident former executive. I was a broken woman, unable to keep her own daughter warm, doubting every choice that had brought us there. The loneliness was a physical weight. At night, while Sophie slept restlessly, I curled up in the corner of the communal bathroom, the only place with a shred of privacy, and replayed every decision. Had I been selfish? Had my insistence on defending David's truth cost Sophie her health? The Covingtons were not only stealing our present, they were erasing our past and blocking our future. I looked at myself in the fogged mirror, deep dark circles under my eyes, pale skin, trembling hands, and did not recognize the woman staring back. That was the bottom of the pit. There was nowhere left to fall, no one left to call, no shoulder to cry on. All that remained was the echo of the question haunting me: was there any way back from an abyss this dark? At the bottom of that pit, I discovered that truth is a weapon even the Covingtons cannot buy. It was in the dawn after Sophie's fever that something inside me broke and rearranged. The pain was no longer just a weight. It was fuel. I remembered David not with longing, but with cutting clarity. He had always said the Covingtons feared public scandal more than financial loss. Their reputation was their most precious fortune, and I, obsessed with private justice, had underestimated the power of exposing their insides to the world. This new perspective did not come from a single moment of enlightenment, but from the relentless repetition of our suffering. Every cold night, every contemptuous glance, every frightened whisper from Sophie was a hammer blow forging my determination. I was no longer fighting to reclaim what was mine. I was fighting to unmask the farce that had destroyed our family. If they had used the law as a weapon, I would use the truth as a shield. Help appeared from where I least expected it, in the line for a community soup kitchen where I went to get food for Sophie and myself. Maria, a woman with gray hair and eyes that had seen decades of silent servitude, approached me with a look of recognition. She had been a housekeeper for the Covingtons for 20 years, fired abruptly after David's death for questioning orders. Her calloused fingers clutched a cloth bag, and inside it, an old envelope with photos and documents she called the secret Robert Covington buried. In a low voice, amid the murmur of the line, she told me how the family had forged signatures on business papers, diverted charity funds, and, worst of all, pressured witnesses to cover up the real circumstances of David's accident. It had not been an accident, but the result of a violent argument with Robert about my future and Sophie's. Maria had kept these proofs out of fear, but when she saw Sophie, pale and frightened, she decided her silence made her an accomplice. That alliance was no coincidence. It felt like the universe handing back a fragment of justice in the middle of chaos. I held her trembling hands and, for the first time in months, felt that I was no longer alone. The bold plan was born that same night, in the quietest corner of the shelter. I would no longer fight over inheritances in court. I would expose the Covingtons' hypocrisy in a lawsuit for moral damages and psychological manipulation, using Maria's evidence as the foundation. I would find a lawyer willing to take the case in exchange for a percentage of a future settlement and file a suit that focused not on property, but on the violation of our basic rights, the right to David's memory, to Sophie's honor, to our dignity as a family. It was a risky plan. The Covingtons would retaliate with renewed fury, and I had no resources for a long war. But I no longer wanted to play by their rules. I was creating a new game, where transparency was the weapon. I drafted an outline of the complaint, detailing every lie, every coercion, every act of cruelty, and as I wrote, a rush of noradrenaline coursed through me, the sharp energy that comes when anger finally becomes strategy. The decisive action took place on a Monday morning, in the office of a lawyer specializing in human rights, whose name I had found on a list of pro bono professionals. Dr. Almeida, a middle-aged man with eyes that reflected both weariness and a stubborn belief in justice, listened to my story in silence. When I showed him the evidence, photos of altered documents, Maria's signed and dated statements, even discreet recordings of veiled threats, he did not hesitate. "This is not about money, Elena," he said. "This is about restoring the truth." We filed the complaint that afternoon, with copies sent to the local press, a calculated move to prevent the Covingtons from burying the case in quiet hallways of power. Leaving the courthouse, the afternoon sun warming my face, I felt a surge of dopamine. It was not the anticipation of victory, but the reward of having taken a real step forward. Sophie, beside me, squeezed my hand with a strength I had not felt in months, and her shy smile was my greatest fuel. The case was no longer about getting our money back. It was about proving that our story was worth more than their entire fortune. And for the first time, I believed we could win. The final confrontation revealed not only the rot behind the Covingtons' wealth, but the resilience that is born when you truly have nothing left to lose. The lawsuit was not just a trial. It was a mirror held up to society, reflecting a truth the Covingtons had tried to bury under layers of money and influence. In court, the evidence presented by Maria, forged documents, recordings of threats, detailed reports of corruption, wove an undeniable narrative of systematic abuse. Robert Covington, once imposing in his expensive suits, shrank in the witness chair, his face pale under the cold lights of the courtroom. He was not facing only legal accusations. He was facing the collapse of a legacy built on lies. When the judge gave the decision, recognizing the violation of our moral rights, ordering the restitution of part of the assets and a significant compensation for emotional damages, there were no victory shouts. There was a solemn silence, the kind that exists only after a storm has washed away years of accumulated dirt. Sophie, seated beside me, squeezed my hand, and her soft sigh of relief was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I realized then that justice is not about punishment. It is about restoring a balance shattered by greed. The true resolution came not in the courtroom, but in the weeks that followed, as we rebuilt our lives far from the Covingtons' shadow. We used the compensation not to return to the empty luxury of Greenwich, but but to buy a modest house in a welcoming community in Connecticut, where people greeted us by our first names, not our surname. Those first nights in our new home were filled with silences that did not hurt. It was the sound of peace, finally reached. Sophie slowly regained her laughter, and I rediscovered the simple pleasure of a meal shared without the weight of anxiety. One afternoon she asked me, "Mom, do you forgive the Covingtons?" The question hovered in the air, a test of my own transformation. I did not forgive their actions, the deliberate cruelty, the manipulation. But I forgave the world for making me believe that a person's worth lies in what they own. I forgave myself for doubting, even for a moment, that dignity was worth any sacrifice. That forgiveness was not absolution. It was release. It allowed me to move forward without carrying the burden of hatred, which is as heavy as poverty. A new understanding grew in me like a seed planted in the most fertile soil of adversity. I understood that true wealth is not in what you have, but in who you are when everything is taken from you. David had not left us a material fortune, but a legacy of integrity that in the end proved indestructible. Sophie, now 6 years old, developed a rare sensitivity. She did not see people through their clothes or cars, but through their kindness. In a surprisingly mature conversation, she said, "We used to be rich and sad. Now we are simple and happy." Her words captured the essence of our journey. We had traded the illusion of security for the reality of authentic connection. I, who once measured my value by titles and possessions, now saw myself as a survivor, not a victim. The social humiliation that had once crushed me had become the foundation of a deeper empathy, one that allowed me to see beyond appearances and value the raw humanity in everyone who crossed my path. The legacy I chose to build was not an empire of concrete and steel, but a beacon of hope for other women in the dark. With part of the settlement, I founded Raised Voices, a non-governmental organization that offers legal support, emotional assistance, and basic resources for single mothers in vulnerable situations. It was not about charity. It was about solidarity. The first woman we helped, a mother fleeing an abusive relationship, looked me in the eyes and whispered, "You make me believe it is possible to start over." In that moment, I felt a surge of oxytocin, the bond of sisterhood that transcends circumstances. Sophie, now helping with simple tasks like organizing donated toys, was learning that true power is not in accumulating, but in sharing. Our story, once a tale of loss, had become a testimony of resilience, echoing through communities where other Alinas were searching for their own dignity. The final catharsis came on a quiet night, as I watched Sophie sleeping in her room, small, but full of light and love. She was no longer the frightened girl in the shelter. She was a child whose eyes shone with curiosity and whose heart was wide open. I saw myself in the mirror, not the broken woman from the motel, but someone forged in the fire of adversity, with scars that told a story of survival, not defeat. Our journey had never truly been about defeating the Covingtons. It had been about rediscovering myself. And in that night's silence, I understood that our greatest victory was not what we had recovered, but what we had become, a family united not by blood or wealth, but by shared truths and a love no revenge could corrode. You, watching this, ride the full emotional roller coaster, from the first tension to the final release, and carry with you the lesson that once dignity is claimed, it becomes a treasure no one can ever steal.